Welcome, everyone, to Stepping Into Your Leadership. I'm your host, Christine Courtney. Our goal here is to give you some actionable takeaways that will help you lead your teams. Thanks for joining us on this leadership journey. Let's get started. Hey, guys. I am here in the studio today with Erica Petrelli back by popular demand here in the studio. I'm happy to have her talking about one of her favorite topics. She actually requested, she's like, please, can we do one on this? And I was happy to oblige because I do think there's a lot that everybody can get out of this topic. And that is today we're delving into Walt Disney. It's credited to Walt Disney. Walt Disney and the Imagineering team's creative problem solving and collaborative planning model, which is called the Dreamer, Realist, Critic. So if you've heard that, or maybe you heard something about it a long time ago, or you want to get a refresher, today's a great day to dive into somebody who has introduced it to our team at the leadership program and helps us to use it in our work. And you can use this whether you're an individual, whether you're lead teams, whether you're on a team, you can suggest it to your collaborators, or in our case, we help facilitate it sometimes with other groups as well. So if you want to pick up some tips today on how to be a little better at creative problem solving, about how to work better collaboratively, how to come up with some interesting, innovative, fun ideas that actually could work, today the Dreamer Realist Critic session is for you. So welcome, Erica.
Well, thank you, Christine. I'm so excited to talk about this today.
I know you begged for it. And I'm like, yes, my first person to ask for a topic. So I'm excited.
Well, because it's one of those things that I feel like everyone should know. If you don't know, you're missing out on something that's going to strengthen your own processes and your team. It's just so eye-opening every single time. So I love to shout it from the rooftops.
Let's jump in and to start define it for everybody. Like, what is it? What is the model, the framework?
To give credit where credit is due, it really came into the current formation thanks to Robert Dilts, who is a neuro-linguistic programmer, author, coach, who wrote a book in the 1990s called Strategies of Genius. And one of the strategies that he highlighted was he coined it Disney's creative method. So that from that point on is when it really took shape. How we get there, there's a few different stories of Disney's process. So there's a few different legends or lore on what actually occurred with Walt Disney and his Imagineers back in the 1930s. So I'll tell you the best version that I ever heard, which is my favorite, was that so Walt Disney was known for being a real critical thinker and really loved to take time with new projects and really look at it from a lot of different vantage points. So the version I love best is that Walt Disney and his early team, which then came to be known as Imagineers, a combination of imagination and engineering. So really, we love that blending of the art and science, right? Whenever he had the beginning of a new idea, he and his team would go through 3 separate rooms. Now, other versions of the story was Disney himself would just move to 3 separate chairs. Okay, so take the version you like the best, but the process is the same. So imagine the 3 different rooms. The order is important because the very first room is the dreamer. So in the dreamer room, Disney and his team, Disney would have this seed. It was just a seed of an idea for a movie, for a theme park, a new character, whatever it might be. And he and his team would dream that idea as big as they could possibly imagine it. So that room was filled with all the what ifs, all the possibilities. They dream. What could this turn into? How big could it possibly be? How far reaching could the impact be? What was most important in that dreamer room is that there's no sort of realistic, practical, well, what about this? And have we thought about that? And how is that going to happen? There's no how allowed, and there is certainly no no's allowed. Right?
No yuck in their yum.
No yuck in their yum whatsoever. Or as I love magician Harris III, I love always will say, don't crush the wow with the how. Because so often you have the seed of an idea, and if you get into the logistics too soon, that idea just gets squashed. And the motivation of the person or team who have that idea gets completely fizzled out. If you hit them too quickly with, give me the logistics, right? So Disney smartly is like, let's dream only first. Then once their dreaming is done, right? They had dreamed it as big as they could possibly dream it. The next room or chair they would move to is the realist. And I think a critical part of this, which we will come back to later, is that the whole team is committed to this. So everyone is on board with this version of thinking. So everyone was dreaming in the dreaming room. When they move to the second room, the realist, everyone goes into realist mode. And in the realist room, you get to run around in the how. What permits do we need? What kind of team do we need? What's the timeline? How will we make it in that timeline? What kind of funding do we need? All of the how on earth are we actually going to make this dream come true? Let's get into the actual tangible, practical questions. So the realist room is filled with a lot of questions. How are we going to turn this dream into a reality? Let's talk time, budget, people, space, obstacles, whatever they could think of in that realist room, which, as you can imagine, starts to bring that dream, starts to shrink that dream down a little bit, bring it down to size. But everyone's committed to that. So then they have this dream that's surrounded with realistic questions. And when they feel like they've asked all the questions they can think of, they move to the final room or chair, which is the critic. And the critic is the opposite of the dreamer, because in the critic's room, only no's are allowed. The job of the critic space is to tear the dream to pieces. Here's all the reasons why this idea is not going to work. Here's all the problems. Here's all the things that make this the worst idea you've ever had, Walt Disney. So they collectively and together really just kind of rip it to shreds, intentionally trying to forecast the problems, really trying to think through, these are the obstacles that are clearly going to get in our way, and getting all of that out on the table. So legend has it that Disney really appreciated this process, because the thinking was, if there's any idea left once it's finished with the critic room, then that's a strong, solid idea. They're going to move forward with that project because they've already thought about the logistics. They've already thought about the potential pitfalls. That idea still has life in it. Let's go forward. If there was nothing left, it was dust. They obliterated the idea. By the time they finish the critic room, it's not ready. That project's not ready yet. So it goes off into the waiting room, and eventually maybe comes back into the dreamer room when it's taken a new form or when the time is right,
So interesting.
So he used it as a brainstorming idea. Mm-hmm. And Dilts, in his book, in that sort of Strategies of Genius, that's how it was first really presented. This is a very creative way to brainstorm strategically, so that you're looking at a problem or a project or an idea from 3 different perspectives. It really took a nod from, a lot of people are familiar with Edward de Bono's 6 Thinking Hats. That came out in the 80s, right? So in the 1980s, the 6 Thinking Hats, Edward de Bono coined the term lateral thinking. And it's a similar process. So in the 6 Thinking Hats, if we sat down with our team and we said, we're going to brainstorm this idea for a new curriculum or a new geographical market or whatever we're going to brainstorm, we would, as a team, put on one of the 6 hats at a time. So there's the heart hat, and there's the brain hat, and there's the let's tear it down hat. And there's, so there's the same idea that you're looking at. It's really inviting you to expand your thinking and think about how you're thinking.
No, I think that it's really interesting in terms of having a strategy for brainstorming, because sometimes people who hate brainstorming, oftentimes their biggest complaint is like, oh, why are we even talking about these ideas that are completely impractical? Because the facilitator, whoever, the people running the brainstorming meetings never get to the stage of the practicality part or poking holes in it, right? We either like to stay here or we stay here, and this middle part doesn't ever seem to happen. And so it's kind of not, I've done both things. Obviously, you've taken us through the process at work many times of, is there a shorter term for it? Dreamer, critic, realist critic?
No, I haven't heard a nice,
they need some marketing.
Acronym.
They need some like acronym thing for it. The ARC program.
You could just call it Disney's creative method.
Yeah. It's still long,
It's still long, Dreamer, realist, critic, the DRC.
The DCM.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I've done the hats as well. I think we've even tried that at work. I've also tried it with a bunch of CEOs, which is just hilarious, because no matter what hat you put on them, they're still going to do whatever their preference is, and have to be constantly reminded. But there's a couple of things that you said that I found really interesting. One is that I thought this was funny when I was researching a little more for today. I saw one was a quote that a Disney employee said at the time, who worked closely with Walt Disney. And this person said, you never know which Walt you're going to get. Is it going to be the dreamer? Is it going to be the critic? And apparently the term they used back originally was spoiler. So it wasn't critic, it was spoiler, which I think is really powerful, because that's what dreamers think of critics.
Yes.
That's what's going on in your head, like, spoil this.
100%, 100%. That this, we'll get to that next in this idea of how we perceive each other. And you're exactly right. The dreamers among us think of the critic as the one that's always coming in to rain on our parade, right? Why you always got to ruin all my good ideas. So yeah, that idea of spoiler really puts the kind of emotional emphasis on how the critic feels, like how that critic voice feels or can feel to the others, not to the critic. The critic's like, I'm just being practical.
I actually care more because I want this to happen.
Yes.
You know, they have a different perspective. They think the people who refuse to come down to that kind of, you know, way of looking at it is actually spoiling things. But I'm sure that's why they changed the words eventually. But I did think that gave it the kind of impact that it seems to have in the moment on folks who are flying high with those ideas in the beginning.
Yeah. What was interesting, what you said about the brainstorming process and watching what happens in teams, is that the common mistake that we make in teams is our brainstorms are too wide open. And so it's just unstructured space where we say, let's brainstorm. And as you mentioned, what will happen is then the first idea is usually the direction that the brainstorming goes. Like the first voice on the table, or the first kind of, this is what I'm thinking, everyone just kind of follows that path. And it's hard to actually keep our brains wide open versus a process like this. Not only does it structure, we're going to have time. This is what we're going to do. First, we're going to do this. Then we're going to do this. It relaxes. So if I am coming in as a realist and I'm always the one that's thinking about the practical, you know, I'm looking at the logistics of what we're talking about. And if I don't think I'm going to have time to share my concerns about the logistics, I'm going to check out, roll my eyes. This is nonsense. This dream is nonsense. And I can see it. It's nonsense. So I'm not going to pay attention.
Or you're going to fight it and get those things in early.
Absolutely.
It's
but if
usually
I
one of
know
two.
that my time will come, I can
Yes.
relax and I can stay fully engaged. So that's why it's a brilliant tool for marketing, is that you obviously have to be explicit. You can't assume that people will intuit that their time will come. But if you can explicitly say, first we're going to do this, then this, then this, so everyone's voice and every perspective will have their time, then people can really relax and keep their minds open for the whole process, you know?
Yeah, it's so true. I was with a company yesterday, actually, and I was doing something that we've done a podcast on, and Tatiana will tell me which number it is. It's a couple of bonus episodes on the 6 types of working genius. And actually, this aligns really well with it, because that wonder invention, people who have the genius of wonder invention love playing the parts of the dreamer, right? So it's bonus episode 4. I knew Tatiana would be right there with it. Thank you. But then the people who, you know, that discerner person is really that person who is looking at that going, wait a minute, how can we have to be realistic about this. What's wrong with this? How can we make it better? And that kind of tenacity person is the person who, if you get them early in the process, they know how to roll things out. So they're looking at what are all the things that can go wrong, because they're the person having to troubleshoot all the time. So I think it's great, because this company said to me that their main problem was that they go from invention. They're a biotech startup. They go from invention to having to deliver results. And they're skipping discernment and galvanizing in the middle a lot. And so they called it this cycle of hell that they're in, where they invent, then the people have to deliver, and then they realize it's not right. So they're back to reinventing. And the people are like, we're doing this again. We're never going to get to the end. We're never going to make our Series A. We're never going to, like, all the stresses that come with that. And then the conflict gets really heightened. So they were saying, how do we in meetings follow a process where, because they're process people and they're kind of scientists, right? So they're like, surely there must be a process where we can follow this systematically. And at the time I was like thinking about it, and I wish I had already done this podcast, because now
this is it.
I'm going to send this to them after you tell me exactly how we should do this. But it is true. If you are in that cycle of hell, where you're like, why are we doing the same mistakes? I know, I've been in it many times. This is a really good strategic process that you can try. And I think if I was to have a critique about it, sometimes people can feel that it's forced, or they're like, why do we have to walk to a different side of the room, or why do we have to do a different chairs, or why do we have to be in a different room if you can even do it? It's better. So people feel like In Working Genius, it would be tenacity. In this, it would be critics. If they're the people that are responsible for making something happen, they want to get to that right away because that's where they're good. And we don't like to be in the uncomfortable part of where we're not good. And if you're the wonder dreamers out there in the world, you're great in a brainstorming meeting. You're on fire, right? You have lots of interesting ideas that people are like, wow, that's so good. You hate getting to where people are poking holes in it and you're having to think about how this wouldn't work and how, wait, why do I have to think of this? You hate being in that space where you're not so good. So we force ourselves to push the group where we're most comfortable. And if you're the leader or you're an extrovert, or God help you, both like myself, you can actually mess this whole thing up by pulling the group to wherever you want to be,
Yes.
wherever you feel like you're good. And that's probably the biggest mistake that I know I've done and that I've seen other leaders do.
Well, this you hit exactly on, to me, so the Dreamer, Realist, and Critic as a brainstorming method is, I think, genius. I think there's a reason that it was included in the strategies of genius. But I think what's really compelling is what you just touched on. If you look at any of the sort of personality or preference profiles, whether it's StrengthsFinder or Working Genius or DISC or any of them, Dreamer, Realist, and Critic nods in the same direction, as you just alluded. And so the thing that's interesting for this, because it's easy to think, most of us could say, just based on my description of it, people listening would probably pretty easily be able to say whether they are naturally a dreamer, a realist, or a critic. Because most of us, now there's no generalization, there's no all the time, but most of us have a default setting. So I default to dreamer, right? And so, as you just mentioned, if I'm not careful, it's easier and more enjoyable for me to just collect fellow dreamers and surround myself with dreamers, because then we're brainstorming and we're happy and we're all on the same.
Fun.
It's fun, right? But everyone, realists too, critics too, you collect the ones that are thinking the same way because it's that validation bias or whatever, where it's like, see, we are the right thinkers and they are the wrong thinkers. When the truth is, we need all three thinkers if we want to fully realize, not just a brainstorm, if we want to have a fully realized vision for our company, if we want our team to be as productive as possible, if we want our bottom line, our profits, whatever our goals are, if we want those things to grow, we need all three thinkers and voices on our team. Otherwise, we're always going to be missing the mark. The dreamers are going to, if we collect only dreamers, we're going to live in la la land of happy, clouds and rainbows, but never execute ideas. If we're critics, we're going to spend all of our time thinking about the problems of the innovation and never take the risk. Whereas if you have all three, you're able to look at something from all sides. And that was Disney's thing, is we need to look at it from all sides, and then it's better because of it.
So let me ask you a question. Is it better, or did they find in doing this that they found that it was better to have everybody playing the part of the dreamer at once and then everybody moving to the realist and then everyone moving to the critic? Or did they find it more valuable to have some people playing the role of the dreamer, some people the critic, some people?
Both have merit, but in the heart of the creative method, everyone moves, so that everyone is dreaming at the same time. Because the problem that would emerge, as you can imagine, is if we've got dreamers, realists, and critics talking all at once, we're going to be in conflict and actually not moving forward. Where the point of the process is everyone dreams, so we can really look at this idea, brainstorm, whatever it might be, from this singular state of dreaming. Then let's all collectively look at the realistic questions, logistics. So it has more impact if everyone is bought into. Now, that's not to say if your default setting is critic and if you're in a brainstorming room with a group of people, if you really are genuinely struggling to come up with a dream to add to the dreaming section, it's not to say that everyone has to contribute equally. It's just that you need to your critic voice, because we're not there yet. So when we get to the critic voice, you might be speaking more than you did in the dreamer voice. Because it is, to your point, it's may feel forced or unnatural because of our natural default settings. But if we understand this is for the value of moving our team or this idea forward, and I know I'm going to have my voice will be heard. That's part of psychological safety, right? My voice will be heard. It's just going to be heard in the order in which we've declared. And dreamer has to come first. The order is really important. Dreamer has to come first. If you start with critic, you have no idea. Like, you kill the idea at the starting line,
I love it. I love that it's what to watching your colleagues who have particular roles have to stretch also. It
Yes.
can be fun. Like there's nothing like watching, your finance person
Yes.
who watches the numbers have to dream,
And
and
not ask
without
like,
like
where are we going to find the
an
money for that? Who's,
yeah,
how, what? Yeah.
without a total anxiety attack,
Yeah.
right? Like what? Yeah.
And it is true, the example you gave of the company you were training, if you don't have the time allotted for the realists to talk about all the logistics, you won't actually be moving forward. You will be spinning in that cycle of hell. And if you don't have the realist on your team, you're not going to be thriving. So the lesson here is not just how am I navigating my team time, but the lesson is also who am I bringing onto my team. So if everyone looks around at their team, they should be able to point to at least one dreamer, realist, and critic. If you look at your team and you assess, I've only got realists on my team, then the scales need to get balanced out with some dreamers and some critics. If you want to have a fully, this is optimal implementation of how we move forward as a team. And the other thing too is, I, as a dreamer in my early years, when I saw the critic coming, I would just start to bristle. I'd start bristling a mile away. So like, oh, here comes the grump that's going to ruin all my
Yeah.
fun. But once I understand, no, if I can actually breathe and truly listen, because what the critic who gets a bad rap is trying to do is prevent the obstacles that they see clearly, that the dreamers don't see or don't want to see. So if I, as the dreamer, can really deeply listen, this critic is trying to say, I'm worried that this thing is going to happen. And if we know that that's part of the opening brainstorm process, we can say, okay, that is a potential pitfall. That is a potential obstacle that's going to get in our way. Now, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to prepare for that? How are we going to move around it? So the critics, doom and gloom is actually a blessing. It's a blessing to the idea. And it makes us so much better off in terms of once we get to the go.
Awesome. Okay. So let's think about some tips that people can do to make this happen. Like, what are some ways that you can set this up, whether it's with your individually, because sometimes you don't have a group, right? Sometimes it's just you trying to brainstorm something and you're like, well, I want to try it. There could be some tips for that. There could be for working with a team, it could be working with your kids on colleges, could be anything, right? So what are some tips? What would be one? Let's just ping pong what we can think of back and forth. What's a tip that you would say to people that we're going to try this process?
Well, I love the idea that you mentioned. It could be me, myself, individually. I have the spark of an idea or a thought for myself. Maybe I want to try something new, do something new, go somewhere new. I have an idea and it's still fresh and I'm not ready to share it to anyone yet. I can still bring myself through this process. And the easiest way to do that is to literally get out a piece of paper and make 3 columns: dreamer, realist, and critic. And if you really struggle to stay in your lane, trifold that paper so that your dreamer column is the only one in front of you. You just journal out all the dreaming, then fold it over to the realist, then the critic, and then look at it all together. So that's the quickest and easiest way because, journaling is so cathartic when we're doing individual work because understandably, we might not be ready to share with a person, but journaling is a conversation. And so you can really see this is where my idea is taking shape and some things might surprise us. So that's the number one way if it's just me, myself, and I want to be a dreamer and a realist and critic. I can do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Something that you taught me, and I think you probably got it. You can correct me, but I think you probably got it from the Leonardo,
Yes.
How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci book. But if you were to take that idea if I yes and that idea, to put a timer on during that when you're the dreamer and just don't allow yourself to stop writing.
Yes.
Just keep writing. Sometimes we think, oh, if I have 3 things down in this column, I'm good.
Yes.
Especially if you're not a natural dreamer. Make yourself get to 11, because something crazy starts to happen after 5.
Yeah.
5 things sound pretty, your dreams aren't that big, but when you have to keep going,
yes,
sometimes when it's uncomfortable. And I think likewise, if you're a natural dreamer and then you're in the critics, it's easy to put 3 easy critiques down that maybe if you had to really dig in longer, you would get somewhere after, between 5 and 11 ideas somewhere there.
Yeah, I think timing it is a really good idea for exactly the reason you said. In the book, How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci, his exercise is 100 questions. And that's a great primer because that's almost the pre-work before you get to this work because it's just inviting you to uncover what you're thinking about. Because when we're asked to just ask 100 questions. Well, what am I supposed to ask? What do you mean ask 100 questions? But to your point, the longer you put pen to paper and challenge yourself, the more your subconscious, unconscious self becomes conscious. And you may surprise yourself what emerges. So I do love the idea of, if you take the 3 columns approach, to make sure you give each column its respectable amount of time, right? Yeah, give it its space.
So I have a clarifying question for you. Okay. Let's say you understand the scope, you understand the client, the vendor, whatever the problem is that you're trying to solve for, right? Whatever you're trying to create. You then go into the dreamer room. You have all these ideas, these crazy ideas. You have them up on Post-its, let's say, all over the room. You have all this stuff. Then what happens exactly? Do you take one? How do you decide which one or which 2 we're taking into the next room, or we're putting on the second hat of Realist?
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's the part that gets skipped. And then we're in this Realist room and now we've got 1,000 ideas that we're going at. Like, is there a process of that?
It's a great question. So to clarify, in this brainstorming process, what you're dreaming is one idea, and you're just dreaming it big. So it wouldn't be the case where you're like, what are all the possible things we as a company could do in 2024? Let's dream all of them. In that scenario, you would take one and bring it into the Realist room. But in the version that we most often talk about, you would be instead saying, here's an idea for a new product that we want to launch in 2024. Here's a shoe we want to make. Let's think about this shoe. What are all the things we can imagine about this shoe? So it stays one idea that then goes, it just is big. So Disney would be like, if I have an idea for a theme park, we're dreaming about that theme park. What are the rides? What is the space? Where's the city?
So they had a scope that was pretty clear already from the start.
One idea is introduced, and that idea goes through, imagine this idea
through the
process. And then if that idea is still breathing at the end, it gets implemented. It's like, gets a team. The Imagineering team gets to work. If there's no life left in it, it gets put back to the drawing.
Interesting. I wonder who makes that decision. I mean, there must be a process of like, let's go back. You know, like, I wonder if somewhere along the line you're like, this isn't going to work. Let's pick another one of those ideas. Well, okay. Well, that's good. That gives us an idea, because I think sometimes it's good to have a clear imagining of it. Now, Tatiana just popped on because she's got an idea for brainstorming alone. I'm sure she does, because I've seen her notebooks. So, Tatiana.
In brainstorming alone is doing something different at each stage, meaning like, if you grab a big pad of paper and you're drawing something or drawing out a big idea, mind mapping, then I would come back with my markers, different colored markers maybe, and start doing something different, or putting Post-it notes on top of it so that it's actually doing something different. You know, like, I know for myself, I do have like supplies of large drawing pads and also different types of Post-its. You know, like, I love to have different kind of Post-its just all over the place and just kind of write out my ideas. But I think in the different stages of like, oh, let me draw this out, let me map this out a little bit, because then you can start to see like, oh, where would someone have a problem with this?
I love that. And never underestimate the power of supplies. I mean, if you guys have taught me that, you nothing else, you've taught me that. People love colored Post-its. We love it ourselves. If you're going to do it, you know, you have to brainstorm something. Invest in some new markers, invest in some colored pencils, even for yourself.
Well, and it's a great segue into another way, you know, because the ideal version is not always practically applicable of, let's all together go in this room and then this room and then this room. But the heart of the dreamer, then the realist and the critic, can be implemented in so many different ways. And one way is based on what you two just said, which is the idea of colored Post-it notes. So if you have the idea on the whiteboard, the flip chart paper, whatever you have, and you've spent time dreaming in it, you can invite your participants to then add to the dream, let's say in a yellow Post-it note. And then you spend some conversation in the realist, and then invite anyone to add to the realist stuff in a blue Post-it, and then the critics in green or whatever. That way, if you're having just a natural conversation during a staff meeting, then it could be such a thing, Christine, where I don't have to wait for the critic moment. I had a critic thought. I'm going to grab the green Post-it and add it to I had another dream idea that we didn't get to, so that you can just assign colors, and then people can.
Great tip.
The thoughts can emerge.
Great tip. Because people say to me all the time, how do I hold on to this thought when I have it? I'm afraid I'm going to lose it.
Write it down.
If you have just write it on you don't even have to put it up. Just have it ready to go. And that'll relax your brain to listen more, right?
Anything that we can do to do exactly that, which is relax your brain and tell it that it can trust this process, that your voice will be heard and there will be a moment. So if it is, give you 3 different color Post-it notes and have them in front of you and just jot them down as they emerge.
Another thing, another tip that you can use when you're kind of categorizing your ideas, when you hear people say their ideas out loud, some people get it. Some people love like just what we call a gallery walk, where things are up on the wall and they read it silently first. And then sometimes things stick out to you that might not necessarily have done so if you just heard them. So sometimes seeing them and allowing people to read in silence, it can be helpful, especially for introverts.
Well, I read once that Jeff Bezos at Amazon has a thing that he calls disagree and commit. And so to your question, it's that idea of there always has to be an adult in the room. Eventually you have to decide, are we moving forward? Are we not moving forward? And you can imagine that with certain ideas, people might have emotional attachment. And so to prevent yourself from just spinning in circles still. So the disagree and commit, what he said was, how do you prevent the water cooler gossip, the meeting after the meeting, the boss said we're going to do this and nobody says a word in the meeting and then everyone grumbles about it. And in those kind of situations, everyone grumbles about it and then shows up less than their best. If I don't like this idea, so it's not the dreamer, realist, and critic, but this idea of everyone will have the chance to express their opinion. So I love it for this as well, is that if we do this model with integrity, the dreamer's voice has been heard, the realist voice has been heard, the critic's voice has been heard, and then the designated team leader makes a decision. And if there's people in the room that disagree still, they think I still don't think this is a good idea. They can voice their disagreement, but they commit 100%. They're like, I disagree, but we're going forward and I commit fully. I'm committed to making this a success. It really allows a sort of like, I've gotten it off my chest and now I'm going to give you 100%. And then in 3 months' time, we're going to look back. If the idea is failing, flopping, floundering, we'll revisit it. So there's that too. We don't just commit blindly. If the idea is we say yes, but it really should have been a no, we're gonna reevaluate in a designated amount of time,
And everyone then gets heard or has the opportunity to be heard and acknowledged.
Exactly.
Which most of the time is the biggest complaint about ideas.
Exactly.
Is that I wasn't heard. I wasn't acknowledged for this idea. That takes away that charge from all of that.
Yeah.
So I think that's great. We only have a few more minutes. So let's get some other tips because these are really juicy and good, Erica. So what's one other one?
All right, here's one that might be controversial, but you said something that made me think of this, which is that idea of like, if I'm naturally one of these things, it can feel forced. So let's lean into the force and have cards in a bucket that say dreamer, realist, and critic. So when we're in the middle of a conversation, you're going to say, Erica, tell us what you think, but I have to pull out one of those voices. So, if I'm a dreamer, if I pull out critic, that is going to be hard. So, but it forces me. And sometimes we have to whack our natural thinking. And so if I pull out a card, that tells me what voice I need to speak from. It's the modern version of playing devil's advocate. I'm going to offer this perspective, even though I might in my heart be like, no, I don't believe this is true. I really believe it's a good idea. I have to be saying with my words why this idea is terrible.
All right, good tip. That's a good tip. Another one that I have that I noticed you doing when you were introducing the idea, and I made a note of it, is that you did not start with a lot of statements. You started with questions, which I thought were good. You started with wonder questions, dreamer kind of questions, and then you had questions, very realistic questions, like what is this going to mean? What could go wrong here? What are the potential pitfalls? I thought that was interesting to, you're a natural facilitator, but I think it's also good for us to push ourselves not to just, to start with questions. So that would be my tip.
I love that tip so much. Questions are so much more powerful than declarative statements, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
Declarative statements, especially when offered by a leader in a session that's meant to be brainstorming, shuts down the brainstorm. Even without the leader probably realizing it, this is fact, or this is truth, or this is the way, you're closing the door to the pathway of brainstorming.
Yeah.
So questions are so powerful for opening up thought. And so, yeah, absolutely in every step, asking some of those what if questions, how questions. And then with the critic, it's still a wide open space of let's think about what could go wrong. Let's think about what we're not thinking about. What are the pitfalls? Who are the competitors? it's a more playful SWOT analysis, honestly.
I love this question in the dreamer because I have a tendency. I mean, I would be interested in what the reality of this is. No one's probably ever tested it, like where people mostly fall. But I kind of tend to fall. I'm a big discerner. I probably stay in that very realist camp too much for my life in general. Right. And I have loved when people have pushed me with this question in the dreamer potential to say, Christine, what if all goes well? What if it goes beyond your wildest dreams? Like, what could actually go? What if it all went amazingly?
Yeah.
And that has sometimes opened up my thinking to like, wow, I'm allowed to think that. Like, okay, here we go. And that was kind of a fun opposite of what if it all goes wrong,
Yes.
which you have to do too. But, so I thought that was kind of interesting, and to kind of try to bring the same passion and enthusiasm to all sections, So what's another tip?
Well,
Yeah.
just to put an exclamation point on that, this is really, you said this at the beginning and you just inferenced it now with, as the leader, you yourself have to give the same passion and enthusiasm to all three segments of the conversation, even if your personal default is in one. So if you're personally defaulting to realist, you will, without even possibly realizing it, want to give that more passionate conversation and more time. But as the leader, it's important that you remain sort of net neutral, and all three to the observer for you are important, wonderful, brilliant contributions. Otherwise, you're going to sway the playing field.
Yeah, I had this question down because in these things, I struggle for sure. How to bring my best self, my full self, but yet not sway the group, because I am powerful in my own company, not when I'm an outside facilitator, it's easy. So I think for me, it's a clue to tamp down my passion and enthusiasm a little bit, but to be equal in that is really hard.
It is.
The only way I can do it is to kind of be quieter than I would like to be.
Well, I think we've already given the ways. It is so hard. Self-awareness is the first step in everything. But in this process, the two ways that you help yourself are to explain this process to your team and have it written explicitly, dreamer, realist, and critic, so that you allow yourself the ability, kind of the forced ability, to back off and to say, I've said this is what we're doing. And the tip you just gave, which is stay in questions, not statements. Those two things help you, whether it's dampen the emotion or, lead to the answer that you want.
So you just gave me an idea for a tip.
Okay.
And I think we do this anyway, but I hadn't thought of it as something. If you're the leader, don't lead this.
Oh, that's
good. Don't lead this process. Like the worst, because it's impossible to keep, people are looking to you for clues because you affect how their family can be fed. Do you know what I mean? So like that, to me, get an outside facilitator, happy to do it. Erica's happy to do it.
Right, because as an outside facilitator, I don't care. I have no stakes.
I don't care. I am neutral.
Right.
Or assign them, have people in the group that can facilitate in your organization that can be neutral.
That's a great idea.
Hard to do. And have a little training maybe on it, which would be even better, right?
Yeah, because as long as everyone understands the context and sort of the rules of the game, one don't do.
Oh, I love don't do's.
Don't take your team, divide them into 3 groups, and send a dreamer group into one room and a realist group in another room. You can see how people would do this, right? Let's split into 3 groups. Yeah. No, because then you're going to have an all-out brawl when you come back, and everyone will be fighting for their rightness. And everyone will be very sure of their rightness. So don't divide. The idea is not division, but unification through these 3 very disparate, landscapes. So
I feel like I've done that. Yeah, and then have lunch, and then be like, okay, we'll have lunch now. We'll be back later. And then everyone's pissed.
Murder. They're like, I hate everyone that works in this company.
Yeah, it's terrible when you leave a creative problem-solving session and everyone's more mad at each other when they started.
So unification, not division.
I love that. I love that we're ending on a don't. I think that's a great don't. Try it. Try it individually first if you want. Try it in a small group next. See how it goes. Learn from that. And then, do it with a bigger group and so forth and so on. These things work best when we practice, right? So practice small and then
say it out loud. Don't forget, this sounds like an obvious, but say it out loud. This is what we're doing. Otherwise, you won't have success. And you'll be like, why isn't anyone going along with me? If it's only in your head, you won't succeed. So while it might feel obvious, be very clear with the intention in the process so that people can be on board with you.
Yeah, think introducing it like you did with a little bit of history too helps people get on board, especially your skeptics in the room. They go, well, Disney's a very, a company that's succeeded over time. They might know what they're doing. I'll give it a go. I'll listen to it. So that's a great last tip. Tatiana, I see you're on here. You want the last word?
Yeah, I was going to give the last tip.
Okay.
Do it with something start practicing with something that doesn't matter.
Right.
Like, what are we going to eat for lunch the next time we have our meeting? You know what I mean? Like, and you just can see how people go, and
That's
then just kind
true.
of have fun with it. Just have something like
low stakes.
Yeah.
Low
That's
stakes.
a good idea.
I love it. That's a good idea. What are we going to have for lunch? Now I'm hungry. All right. Thank you, Erica, for joining us. Thank you, Tatiana, as usual, from the producer's box in today. More than usual. Love to hear your voice. Erica, thanks for introducing this to folks. Hopefully, if you have done it before, you can learn to do it a little bit better by reviewing some of these tips. And I'm sure we'll have Erica back in the lounge again soon.
I can't wait.
All right. Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I'd like to give a special shout out to our podcast producer, Richard Francisco. Check out our notes for any details. And if you get anything out of this, please follow us. And if you enjoy it, please take a moment to rate us or write a comment. It will mean the world to us. We'd love to hear from you. And if you just can't get enough, follow me on TikTok and check out tlpnyc.com/podcast for more information.